So what I've done here is started to model the cowling. I did a bunch of modeling and just kind of recorded it, and I'm doing this voiceover to kind of explain some of my method anyway. It would just get mind-numbing to sit and watch the hours upon hours that it takes to actually do all of this. So I've got this sped up quite a bit. With complex shapes, which this aircraft turns out to have a lot more complex shapes than I initially thought, but I found that it's easier to go about modeling as you're seeing here in the video by creating some of those complex shapes and slowly just building up the pieces rather than, say, starting with a large cylinder and trying to shape that to the shape of the fuselage and then trying to cut holes in the cowling and things like that. I find it's easier to just model the details from the beginning. You'll see, like right there, I'm using the proportion edit tool so that as I move one thing, I can move multiple. It helps to keep things kind of smooth, and so I'll jump in and out of using that. But there's definitely a lot of just grabbing the vertices and moving them around to build our shape. You'll also notice that I will be jumping back and forth to a lot of reference images, which I have a second monitor here that those images are up on almost all the time. So even though you don't see them on screen, I'm looking at reference images quite often. So it then just becomes a matter of slowly moving and making everything kind of fit to the shape that we are looking for. And you'll notice that there's no real quick, easy way of doing it. Now there is the subsurface modifier that a lot of people use, but that, in my opinion, is very wasteful. You'll end up creating a ton of extra geometry that you don't need, and it just can end up hurting performance. My opinion is you should always build from the beginning an optimized mesh rather than trying to fix it later on. And so you'll see as we just go along that there's just a lot of tweaking and trying to create the shape. And this shape turned out to be rather tricky. There was a lot of back and forth, and you'll probably see me redo a few things a couple different ways, trying to figure out what's the best way to create that shape. Right there, for example, I'm just extruding out a single vertice to kind of create the shape, and I just continue along to make this complex curve that we have going on right here at the front of the cowling. Also, as you can see here, I'm trying to get some of the main shape of the cowling built, and then I'll fill in the rest of it as we go. But I'm trying to get kind of the top and the bottom and the side shape, and then I come back and I start to fill and piece together stuff. Another good point to make is you want to make your geometry clean, and by clean I mean using squares. You want to avoid triangles as much as possible, and it ends up helping you a lot later on in your build, because as long as you maintain squares and you maintain basically loops, then you're able to add loop cuts and you're able to modify your mesh a lot easier later on. If you need a little extra geometry somewhere, you need to remove a section of geometry, it's a lot easier if you've maintained these squares. If you start putting triangles in things, it just gets a lot trickier, and it's just a better practice to maintain using squares. You'll notice that I struggled quite a bit with the shape of the top of the cowling molding into the front there. There's just multiple curved edges and pieces here and there that made things a little bit tricky, and it was just a lot of tedious grabbing a hold of vertices and moving things. And then I also used the smooth vertex option that once I get my geometry somewhat close, it kind of helps to smooth things out, and then I'll tweak more, and then I'll smooth it, and then I'll tweak more, and then I'll smooth it. And I eventually get to something that I am fairly happy with, but there's just a lot of trial and error to make things, especially when you have multiple curves all trying to come together. It's just a lot of trial and error to make that all work. Right there was actually a good example of where having things in quads was helpful, because I was going to end up with a triangle, but I was able to throw in a loop cut and continue my geometry. farther we get into this, you'll begin to notice that my reference images prove to be not nearly as accurate as I had hoped. My model ends up not following them exactly, and I start to look for new reference material because the low-res background images that I originally have just end up not fitting the correct shape of the aircraft, and so you'll see that things begin to not quite mesh with the background image, but that's just kind of something that's bound to happen. You're never going to find something that's perfect unless you have the original engineering drawings. But that's something that you kind of learn to kind of work with, and you're able to work around it. Here's an example. Now that we've got the main shape down, I'm using the smooth vertex option to kind of smooth out a lot of my corners. You know, as you hand place things, they're just going to end up a little bit rough, and so I use the smooth vertex to smooth a lot of that and just help to make it look better. So now at this point I'm basically drawing a line where the cowling is split, and getting ready for that because I want the cowling to be able to be two pieces. And you can see that I'm just lining up a row of vertices that's going to align with that split. Again, doing more with the smooth vertice. Now that's something you have to keep an eye on. Usually you don't want to grab your full model because it'll tweak everything you want to do little sections at a time, like you see me doing here, to help it smooth out. If you just grab the whole thing and say smooth it out, it'll be way off from your original drawing, and you'll end up tweaking everything back just to get it to match again. Okay, so here you'll see that I have duplicated my cowling, and then I've scaled it down and basically stuck it inside the original. And what I'm doing is I'm creating the inside edge of the cowling. That's another thing you want to do while working with X-plane is you don't want two-sided faces. You're much better off to create a second set of faces and basically build the inside and the outside of an object. You don't want to just create the object and then say it's two-sided. It's just not very good for X-plane performance, and you'll have better flexibility with textures and things like that as well when you build it separate like this. And of course now you can see I joined those two parts once I got the inner piece fitting the way I wanted. I joined them, and then I'm filling in the edges so it's just one solid piece now, because there's no reason for it to be separate items. And then there you see I cut the top from the bottom because I do want those to be separate, just for the future option of being able to remove the cowl and see the engine inside. And then here you just see me stitching together the hole that was created from cutting it in half. It's also very helpful when you're working on things like this to hide other pieces of geometry, and you do that simply by hitting H. You select the object you want to hide and you hit H, and then when you want to bring it back you hit Alt H, and that helps a lot. For an example right here, I've got everything but the tiny little bit that I'm working on hidden, and it just makes it a lot easier to work on those things without accidentally grabbing something else. Here you see I'm just cutting out the little oil door that is in the top of the cowling. I'm making sure that my faces all line up, and then I've cut that out, and then I stitched together the hole on the cowling, and I've made the little door a separate piece, and then I will go into that door piece and I'll stitch its edges back together as well, and just make everything look neat. I've also hit W to bring up my bevel option so that I can gently round those corners and just make that look a little smoother. Okay, so here I've started to unwrap. You see I brought up my UV image editor in a separate window. I found that it's really just tedious and tiresome and a pain in the neck if you get your whole model done and then you go back and try and unwrap everything. It just can turn into weeks and weeks of unwrapping, and it just gets kind of mind numbing. So I found that I prefer to unwrap something once I feel I'm satisfied with the product. I will do my unwrapping of that piece before I move on to something else, and that just helps later on. Now X-Plane is a little interesting with the texture way that it goes, and obviously we're not just going to do a texture for just this top piece of the cowling, but later on when we get to that point I will demonstrate how I use the texture atlas to put all of these textures into one sheet so that we're not wasting space and we're not creating more textures than we need to. But you can see here that I'm just trying to get a good amount of our texture, and I want it to not be stretched, and that's what you're seeing in the image editor there. I've got the stretch option showing, so the lighter blue is showing that the texture is being stretched, and if it's a dark blue then it isn't being stretched. And we want everything to be as dark blue as possible so that when we go to actually do our paint job we're not having any funny stretching, and it just makes it a lot easier to get crisp textures on our stuff if we manage to avoid stretch. And still I'm trying to pack it all in fairly neat and tight so we're not wasting a whole lot of texture space, and then later on we'll do an additional pack. Now here you see I've taken a copy of the back edge of the cowling and I'm using that to begin the fuselage so that we have a good meeting point for our fuselage and the cowling. And now I'm gonna start working on the cowling, and it becomes a little bit tricky, and you'll see I end up redoing a few things, especially around the main windscreen, because it proved to be a little trickier than I had anticipated. I eventually get it figured out, but you'll kind of watch as I stumble through trying to get this shape, because this windscreen being so bubbly as it is, it just ended up being a little trickier than I had expected. You'll see here I'm trying to use a circle to get the right smooth shape, which ended up being a bad idea, and it didn't end up working very well for me. But as you follow along, you'll see that there's a lot of trial and error, but I like this method better than building just a big cylinder and then trying to tweak it. It's a lot easier to just go one square at a time. And use reference images. You'll notice I pull up my reference images quite often, and I have them on a separate display. But if you want it to look right, you've got to keep referencing images, because your one background image or two background images or however many, it's just not going to get it for you. You've got to have a lot of images from all different angles so that you can figure out that shape, because these shapes end up being a lot more complex than just a couple 2D images is going to help you figure out. And you'll see that this shape, it becomes a bit of a fight for me, and I spent a couple hours just trying to get the windscreen right, but you'll eventually get it. And I'm just going through it the same method I used on the cowl, to kind of piece it all together. So right here you can see that I've realized that that windscreen line I've got just isn't going to work, and so I end up deleting a whole bunch of stuff, and then I'm going to extrude this main shape back because I know the windscreen actually has to fit that shape, and I'm going to reshape the line that I've already created to fit the shape of the fuselage that's already been defined by our cowling. And so I go through and tweak all of that, and it ends up with a much better result. And here I'm using the little magnet snapping tool. That's helping the vertices snap to either a face or an edge or a vertex that is in that area, and it helps to match up to that piece that I have extruded. You'll also notice as we go along that I am outlining key structure pieces such as the windscreen and the doors as I build, rather than trying to go back and use like a boolean to cut them out. You'll end up with a much cleaner, much smoother, better looking model if you just model those into it as you build, rather than go back and use a boolean. A boolean's gonna cut a big hole and take away all the time that you've spent trying to create your quads, and it's going to it's just going to create a mess, especially when there's complex corners. And if you can just take the time to just model it in as you go, like I am here, it will give you a much cleaner model. And later when we go to cut out the doors, they'll already be shaped. It'll be a matter of selecting the polygons and just cutting them out, and then we can go ahead and animate, and it makes things much smoother. Here you can see I'm trying to create the now curved shape that the fuselage becomes later towards the back of the model. It's a little bit tricky to try and transfer from the more square side to a fairly rounded tail, and so I'm using that shaped circle to kind of give me a guide. I find that that actually ends up not working perfectly for me, but it helps to get things a little bit closer and a little smoother on your corners and things like that. And it ends up taking a lot more tweaking, and you'll see that as we go along. But this transition ended up being a bit of a trick to work with, and you'll see as I kind of struggle through that, but we eventually find a smooth transition. transition here at the back edge of the wing turned out to be a rather tricky bit with the really tight curves that is there and just how that piece is made. And you'll see I end up tweaking it quite a bit and getting it close, and then here's one spot where I actually will use the subsurface modifier to help me with such a complex shape. But you'll see I'll cut out that piece. Now it's actually a separate fairing piece on the real aircraft anyway, and so I'm just going to make, once I get it close, I'm going to make that separate fairing piece using the subsurface modifier to help me make that shape. And the reason I feel it's okay to do it on this small piece is because I separate it from the main model, and it's just a small little section, and so it's not going to add thousands and thousands of extra faces. It's just going to add a little bit, but it greatly enhances the shape of that one fairing, which I think is really key to the look of this particular aircraft. So right there you can see that I removed that fairing piece. I just selected the geometry and then P to separate by selected geometry. And here I'm just kind of cleaning up the shape of this a little bit, and then you'll see me go into working on that fairing. So here we go, I've grabbed the fairing and I've added the subsurface modifier on this, and as you can see, it's not a huge piece, it's not the whole airplane, and so I think it's a little more acceptable to use the subsurf here, especially given such a complex shape. Either way, this piece should have been separated because it is a separate fairing and there should be an edge. We don't want to just model everything as one solid piece because it just doesn't look quite as real. We want it to look accurate in the sim, and so if it's a separate fairing, you should model it as a separate fairing. And you'll see as I go along here with the subsurface, I get my shape a lot better using less geometry, and then I create the edge of the fairing and adjust how it interacts with the fuselage so that it will look correct later on, and you'll be able to see that edge of the fairing, and you'll be able to see how it is attached to the fuselage. got the basic shape of the windshield done, I'm going to go through and use the smooth vertex option to try and smooth out all of that, because it's basic shape but it's not smooth. And so that's what you'll see here. And you'll also see that when I do that, I deselect that outer edge. And I do that because if that outer edge is selected when I do it, the whole thing's going to shrink, and we don't want that. We just want to smooth out everything on the inside. So that's why I've got everything selected but the outer edge. And then of course I've got to go back and still tweak some of the spots, especially up in that corner there, because it gets sucked in a little farther than it should have. But it helps to at least smooth things out quite a bit, and then you go back and tweak by hand again your more intricate parts. You can also see now, as I've been adjusting this, my fuselage isn't lining up perfect with the cowling, and that's a fairly simple fix. And once I recognize that, I go back in and I just use the little magnet snapping tool, and it'll snap to the faces. You'll see that starting now. It's snapping to those edges of the cowling, even though it's not part of the current piece that we're working on. And so that's how I'm able to snap it back so that everything lines up nicely again. Here's another good example of reference images being incorrect. I am trying to follow the shape of the background image I have right here, and then I pull in the image of a real airplane and realize that it's completely different. And so I go back to tweaking it using the real airplane. And then here I'm getting ready to clean up just some of the geometry and try and get all my edges and everything nice and clean. And then I think at about this point I decide that I'm ready to start working on something a little different, and so we're going to add in our vertical. And so I do that starting with a circle and shape that. Now you'll notice I rotated that circle so that the points, I have two vertices at the front and two vertices at the very back, because you don't want it to go to just a single vertice. It just doesn't look right in the sim. It makes it a little too sharp. There's never anything really that sharp. So here I just begin shaping out the vertical, trying to do it with, again, not a ridiculous amount of geometry, but I will, as I go along, I will try and cut out that rudder with my geometry, just so that it's easier to cut out later on for when we get ready to animate. And so here I just am getting that front curve just right and getting the shape of our vertical all in. And then you'll see that once I'm fairly satisfied with the shape and size of it, I will actually join it to the fuselage object, because looking at my reference images, this being a fiberglass fuselage, it's all nicely smooth transitions. There's no fairing bolting that vertical on, and so I end up joining it so that we can have that nice transition. So here you can see I've now joined those two objects. I cut out the geometry of the fuselage where the vertical was going to go, and now I just go through stitching all of those edges together to have a nice smooth transition.